They said she was dangerous. They said she spoke with demons. They said she practiced forbidden arts. But centuries later, scientists realized she wasn't a witch. She was a genius. This is a story of a woman who defied ignorance with reason, fought superstition with science, and paid the ultimate price for knowing too much. Her name was Hypatia, Alexandria, once the brightest city on earth, a place where merchants brought silk from India, scrolls from Greece, and wisdom from the farthest corners of the world. It was a city of thinkers, of scholars who believed that truth could be found through numbers, philosophy, and the stars. In this city, at a time when women were told to be silent, one woman dared to teach. Hypatia of Alexandria, philosopher, mathematician, astronomer. Her father, Theon, was a scholar at the great library of Alexandria, the beating heart of human knowledge. From him, Hypatia learned geometry, astronomy, and logic. But from life, she learned something greater, courage. While other girls were taught to sew or serve, Hypatia was taught to calculate the paths of planets and trace the curves of the universe. She grew up surrounded by scrolls, models of the cosmos, and debates that could last for days. To her, numbers were not symbols. They were music. When Hypatia began to teach, her voice carried far beyond Alexandria. Students came from Greece, Rome, Syria, and Egypt to hear her speak. She would stand before crowds of men, governors, soldiers, priests, and calmly draw circles in the sand, explaining the movement of celestial bodies. She believed the earth was not the center of everything, that the stars and planets move in patterns that could be predicted, that there was order in the chaos of the heavens. In her time, such beliefs were dangerous, for the city was changing. The once great library had been burned and rebuilt, but the spirit of free thought was dying. The old gods were fading, replaced by the rising power of Christianity. And in that tension between old and new, between reason and faith, Alexandria began to tear itself apart. Hypatia refused to take sides. To her, truth was not owned by any religion. She welcomed students of every faith, believing that wisdom belonged to all humankind. But that neutrality made her enemies. It began with whispers. She teaches pagan magic, they said. She summons the planets. She calls upon forbidden powers. To those who did not understand mathematics, her diagrams and instruments looked like witchcraft. Her study of light and reflection seemed like sorcery. Her knowledge of motion defied scripture. The streets began to buzz with rumors. In the markets, people spoke her name with fear. In the churches, priests warned of her influence. Still, Hypatia continued her work. She wrote commentaries on geometry. She built astrolabes, devices that could predict the positions of stars. She improved the hydrometer, used to measure the density of liquids. Her inventions guided sailors and inspired astronomers for centuries. But her greatest achievement was not a device or a formula. It was her mind, her unshakable belief that knowledge was sacred. By now, Hypatia had become a symbol of the old intellectual world, a world that was crumbling under religious zeal. The Archbishop of Alexandria, Cyril, saw her as a threat. To him, her influence over powerful men, including the Roman governor Orestes, was intolerable. He accused her of turning men away from God. And soon, the mob took notice. Crowds began to gather outside her home, which, they shouted, "Blasphemer!" Her students begged her to leave the city, but Hypatia refused. "I have done nothing wrong," she said. "I have only sought the truth." The year was 415 AD. The streets of Alexandria were thick with tension. Political riots had erupted, and in the chaos, the church's anger turned toward one woman. One morning, as Hypatia rode her chariot home, a group of men blocked her path. They were monks, members of a sect known for their fanaticism. They dragged her from her chariot, tore away her robes, and beat her. She was taken into a church, ironically called a Caesareum, once a temple of reason, now a place of judgment. There, they accused her of sorcery, of corruption, of witchcraft, but she did not beg for mercy. She looked them in the eye, unafraid, and in that moment, they saw not a witch, but a woman who would not bow to fear. That was her crime. They tore her apart. Her body was burned, her ashes scattered, and with her death, The last great light of Alexandria was extinguished. For centuries, her name vanished from history. The library crumbled. The knowledge she defended was lost to dust. The city that once celebrated wisdom fell into silence. And yet, truth has a strange way of surviving. More than 1,000 years later, scholars rediscovered fragments of her work. Her notes on geometry, her commentaries on Ptolemy's Almagest, her insights into motion and light. They found patterns and equations far ahead of her time. She had described the movement of celestial bodies with such precision that centuries later, Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton would echo her conclusions. She had theorized about the reflection and refraction of light, concepts proven by modern physics. She had built mechanical devices that predated the first scientific instruments of the Renaissance. Hypatia's so-called witchcraft was science. Her forbidden knowledge was mathematics. Her heresy was truth. In 1720, scholars began to call her the first true female scientist. In 2009, NASA named a crater on the moon Hypatia. Astronomers named an asteroid after her. Her legacy, once buried under ashes, now circles the heaven she studied. But her story is not only about science. It's about injustice, about fear, about how society punishes those who dare to think differently. Every age has its witch hunts. In Hypatia's time, they burned scrolls. Today, they burn reputations. In every era, there are voices silenced for asking too many questions. Yet every time someone defies that silence, every time a girl picks up a book, a scientist challenges a norm, or a teacher refuses to stop speaking, the spirit of Hypatia lives again. She once said, "Reserve your right to think, for even to think wrongly is better than not to think at all." It was not just a quote. It was her philosophy. She believed that truth was not the property of any man, any religion, or any empire. It belonged to everyone willing to seek it. Her death was meant to end that spirit, but it did the opposite. Because after her fall came the rise of others, women who followed the same path. Ada Lovelace, the first programmer. Marie Curie, who proved the power of unseen forces. Rosalind Franklin, who saw the structure of life itself. They all carried the same fire that burned in Hypatia's heart. She was called a witch because she refused to kneel. She was condemned because she would not pretend ignorance. She was murdered because she believed truth mattered more than fear. And yet, today, she stands taller than her enemies, not in flesh, but in the legacy she left behind. The Library of Alexandria may be gone, but its spirit survives in every classroom, every observatory, every mind that dares to wonder. And in the quiet halls of NASA, where craters bear her name, her story whispers through the silence of space. She wasn't a witch. She was right. And as long as the stars she once charted still burn above us, so will the memory of Hypatia of Alexandria, the woman who knew too much and dared to tell the world. Watch out for part 2 of this story. Kindly hit the subscribe and notification bell for more updates.